So you might be asking why the Enlightenment is political or is remembered as a political thing when it starts off as a religious thing. Oh, that's a great and yet adorable question, you Americans, you who think that because we have a First Amendment that separates church and state, that therefore religion is not political. And remember that religion and politics being separated is more the exception than the norm in world history. Throughout most of world history, church and state are not separate, they're kind of joined at the hip. And that's certainly the case with Europe during the 17th century, especially in England, remember, where the monarch is not only the king or queen of England, they're also the head of the Church of England. And even in Catholic countries like France, which is, one of the other sort of centers of the Enlightenment, even though the monarch is not supposed to be head of the Catholic Church, the monarch still plays an outsized role in the way the church runs in France or in their respective countries. So, church and state are historically closely aligned during the 16th and 17th centuries in Europe. So, the reason that's important is to criticize religion is not just a matter of theology, it's a political thing as well. If you think about it, the whole idea of monarchy is a little bit absurd. So, a guy or gal is lucky enough to find a fancy hat, and that justifies them ruling over thousands, if not millions, of their fellow citizens. It seems ridiculous. And that ridiculousness is best articulated by the great philosopher Monty Python in the King Arthur scene with all the peasants. Behold, I am Arthur, your king.
Well, I didn't vote for you.
Well, you don't vote for kings.
Well, how did you become one then?
The Lady of the Lake, her arm clad in the purest shimmering samite, held aloft Excalibur from the bosom of the water, signifying by divine providence that I, Arthur, was to carry Excalibur, and that is why I am your king. Listen, strange women lying in ponds distributing swords is no basis for a system of government. Supreme executive power derives from a mandate from the masses, not from some farcical aquatic ceremony. Be quiet! Well, you can't expect to wield supreme executive power just 'cause some watery tart threw a sword at you. And yet, that is exactly what kings expected. If you think about the 17th century, most monarchs justified their rule by divine right. The idea that kings made a promise, a covenant with God to be their divine representative on earth, to basically act in the stead or in place of God. So a challenge to the king or queen was a challenge against God. Of course, a challenge to the church is also a challenge to the monarch, and therefore a challenge against God. So the monarch during this time period is incredibly powerful, much more powerful than they were during the Middle Ages, during the time period of Arthur, if Arthur actually existed in some meaningful way. But even if you don't buy that argument, the fact is that some of the leading proponents of the scientific revolution were actually making a very similar argument in favor of the monarch's divine power. So for those of you who have heard of Thomas Hobbes, basically the Cliff Notes version of Thomas Hobbes and his life or in his life's work is the idea that the monarchy has to be all-powerful. And the reason that Hobbes makes that argument isn't based on religion. Hobbes, for the most part, is I don't think you can say that he's irreligious, but he certainly doesn't have a religious worldview. He's not a theocrat, and yet he kind of agrees with the idea that the king has to be all powerful because in his mind it all goes back to human nature. Hobbes is almost a Darwinist before Darwin. He sees humanity, or the human beings, as basically animals. And if left to their own devices, human beings will devolve into a state of nature. And in his mind, without some kind of powerful authority to rein in the base impulses of human beings. What's going to happen is that, according to Hobbes, it will be a war of all against all, and that life will be nasty, brutish, and short. That's kind of like the main part of Hobbes's work, the Leviathan, that most people remember. So Hobbes basically adopts the view that people suck. And the only way for people to be prevented from embracing their suckage and becoming truly horrible is if there's some strong authority figure waiting to basically bring them back into line. And if that's a king who supposedly rules through divine providence, then more power to them is the idea. So if you understand Hobbes's argument, you can pretty easily understand the significance of this guy, John Locke. A name that you're probably far too familiar with. If there's one person that we probably do to death as history teachers, as civics teachers, whatever, it's John Locke. The guy pops up everywhere. And I don't want to do John Locke to death because, I mean, the guy needs as much help as you can get. I mean, eat a sandwich, dude. I feel like if I shout too loudly at the monitor, he's just going to waste away. So John Locke is kind of a contemporary of Thomas Hobbes. He's an English philosopher, kind of a bureaucrat, a man of letters. But John Locke has a very, very different view of human nature. Hobbes believed that human beings suck. Um, Locke, for his part, believes that human beings are really neither good nor evil. Human beings are just human beings, which is kind of circular reasoning to a certain extent. But Locke really believes that human beings are more byproducts of their environment. In other words, there's nothing in our genes. They didn't know about genes during this time period, but there's nothing in our nature that necessarily predisposes us to be horrible. It really just depends upon what we observe and the views and values that we adopt. This perspective on human psychology um, is called behaviorism, but Locke basically describes human beings and human nature as tabula rasa, a blank slate. Or think about a blank canvas. So, in other words, human nature and personality and who you are is really left up to circumstance to determine. And like a blank canvas, you can eventually paint that in, but it really just depends on what happens. So if human beings are the byproducts of their environment, well, doesn't that mean that human beings are going to respond positively if we guarantee that they have good experiences? So if you can somehow create happiness in the general population, isn't that going to create a better society and a better government? So, in Locke's mind, you don't need some kind of monarchical babysitter like Thomas Hobbes is basically talking about to keep the people in line because human beings aren't really evil. They're blank slates. So, if that's the case, why have government at all? Why do people even tolerate the all powerful autocrats that Thomas Hobbes is so enamored with? And Locke's key insight here is that it all goes back to contracts. In Locke's view, it's a social contract, but it's still a contract nonetheless. What is a contract? So this is for some of my kids who are taking law or mock trial. So a contract is an agreement in which two parties agree to exchange something of value. Contracts can be written, contracts can be verbal, contracts can even be created based upon performance. So Locke's insight is the idea that governments are created not because kings have divine power, because, of course, before the divine right of kings, governments existed previously, and governments would probably continue to exist. I mean, human beings are social creatures. We like organizing. I mean, that's really what we have going for us as a species. It's not speed, it's not muscle mass, it's the fact that we can organize and cooperate better than pretty much any other creature except for, maybe eusocial insects like ants or termites. And they're kind of limited by the fact that they can only communicate with pheromones and not words. So, yeah, that's like the only thing we have going for us, that we're always going to organize collectively in some way, shape, or form. So Locke argues that people organize on the basis of agreements. They might not be. They might be written agreements. They might be unwritten agreements. But if people agree to allow a government to rule over them, it's either because you really are in a situation where you have an autocratic dictator who's going to rule you, or else. But Locke understands that those systems, they don't last very long. Most governments only last if people buy into what the government offers them. So Locke believes that all societies have some type of social contract, that the people agree to give up some things in exchange for receiving things. So, for example, the people might contribute taxes, they might volunteer for military service. What the people give up sort of depends upon the social contract and the expectations that people have. But the government might have to spend money for the public benefit, provide education, provide certain goods and services. And again, the services that we as a society demand, that's going to change with time. It's going to change with as culture changes, as generations kind of die and are born. But that's kind of the way it works, that really governments are not created through divine right, but because the people and the government agree to come together and cooperate in some way, shape, or form. Now, what the state and what the people agree to exchange is going to depend upon time and place. But remember, Locke is mostly concerned with how to make people happy. Because in his mindset, if human beings are happy, they're more than likely going to be good. That's kind of where the whole tabula rasa idea comes in. So how can the government guarantee, or at least increase the odds that people are going to have those good experiences that are going to make them good? And baseline, Locke says that governments should protect and defend certain natural rights. These are rights found in nature. Not necessarily rights given by any kind of divine authority. By the way, this is one of those points where it's worth mentioning that Locke is not anti-religious. He's kind of a-religious. In other words, kind of like Hobbes, he's not looking at the world through an explicitly religious lens. So in his mind, you have rights that are found in nature, and it's the responsibility of the government to protect these rights. Well, what happens if the government doesn't? Or what happens if the government breaks its written or unwritten contract with the people? Well, in every contract, there are written consequences for what's going to happen or what will happen if one party or the other breaks the agreement. So in like let's say a normal contract for buying goods. If somebody breaks the contract, you might get sued. Okay. Well, I mean, I guess you could do that if the legal system allowed for it. But at some level, Locke does say that if the government fails to uphold its end of the bargain, the people have a right to revolt. Gee, I wonder why we study John Locke. Well, I'm going to tell you why. I mean, obviously, you can probably hear the ominous foreshadowing, but also if you're looking at how the Enlightenment in Europe crosses over the Atlantic, we have a pretty clear idea of how Locke's ideas sort of filter down to the American colonists. Because again, Locke himself is an English philosopher, spent some time in South Carolina, by the way, helping write the original constitution of that colony. But the problem that we have to figure out is the extent to which these mostly European figures, you know, altered the consciousness of the colonial population. And we have a pretty clear indicator of how Locke's ideas kind of migrated. So Thomas Jefferson went to school in the College of William and Mary, which was the preeminent college in the southern states, and arguably during that time period, one of the just what maybe the preeminent university slash college in the colonies in general. We know that while Jefferson was at William and Mary, that he studied under the Scottish philosopher William Small, who apparently introduced Jefferson to Locke's writings and ideas. And we get a pretty clear sense that Jefferson was a fan, because as probably most of you know, in the Declaration of Independence, there are certain inalienable rights that Jefferson articulates: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Again, you could kind of quibble over the difference between property and happiness. I guess Locke was much more sort of materialistic at some level, but you get that some of those Lockean ideas in the very document that articulates our reasons for establishing ourselves as an independent society. And by the way, you could also make the argument that this idea of a contract is maybe taken literally. The English Constitution is an unwritten constitution for the most part, and we'll talk a lot more about that when we get to the American Revolution. But our social contract isn't just an unwritten agreement built by custom and time and space. Our social contract is an actual contract, and it's the US Constitution. And you could kind of argue that this idea of the social contract is taken very literally by the founders. So Locke argues that the authority and legitimacy of the government come from the masses, come from the people. So here's what's kind of weird about the European Enlightenment. We do have some indications of how the European Enlightenment affects Americans and American thinkers, but at the same time, as you might remember, the idea of the people coming together and creating social contracts to establish governments, that's not a new idea. You might remember the Mayflower Compact, where we were doing that stuff by necessity, almost a generation before Locke was, writing about social contract theory and the idea of natural rights. So we're going to pick up the pace a little bit with Charles de Montesquieu. probably, if you're familiar with him at all, you associate him with the idea of the separation of powers. Montesquieu doesn't really invent the idea, but he does popularize the idea, and he sort of articulates the reason for why that's a good thing. Again, we have to remember that de Montesquieu is alive during a time where the power of the king, the power of monarchs across Europe, is becoming more centralized. Interestingly, you don't really see that as much in Great Britain. Great Britain has a monarch, obviously, but it also has a parliament that has successfully asserted its independence. And of course, parliament fights a civil war with the crown, which it wins. But Great Britain is kind of the exception to the rule, though. So Montesquieu, who is French-born, is alive during a time where Louis XIV says, "L'État c'est moi," which basically translates out to "I am the state." Now, obviously, not to be confused with "I am the Senate." I am the state. And for Louis XIV, that wasn't just idle boasting. For Louis XIV, that was more or less an objective fact, because if you disagreed with the king, if you thought that the king was stepping beyond his power, or what his power should be, again, what do you do about it? The answer is not much, because if your power comes from God, if you were God's divine representative on earth, then there really isn't anybody or anything with any political legitimacy to ensure that you govern rationally and fairly. Now, if you're John Locke, the solution is, well, if the king or if the government steps beyond where it's supposed to be or supposed to go, well, then that's just going to create a revolution, and the problem will be self-correcting. And Montesquieu's kind of like, well, yeah, but revolution's really messy. And if you're looking at Montesquieu, I mean, in France's case, the French Revolution would be especially messy. So maybe he was onto something. So wouldn't it be better to fix the problem before it actually starts? You know, if you want to protect some of these natural rights that Locke is so keen on, wouldn't it be better to ensure that the government has checks not only coming from the population, but checks within itself? So instead of having the people rise up in revolt, maybe you could have some kind of legislature do that. Or if you can establish laws and rules for the crown to abide by, maybe you can have some kind of independent judiciary. Slap the crown on the wrist if it goes beyond what it's supposed to do. And this is the idea of the separation of powers. The idea that power should be divided into three branches. Now, the problem, of course, as probably most of you know, this is kind of the idea that we happen to adopt. But one of the things you're going to see is that with the separation of powers being divided into three, the question is, are we going to see an equilateral triangle or an isosceles triangle or a scalene triangle? You know, which side is going to have which corner is going to have the longer sides? Which, corner is going to be the most powerful, the most distinguished? And I'll also say this, that even though the American Constitution adopts the idea of the separation of powers in principle, in practice, the branches are almost never completely equal. If you disagree, check out Articles 1 through 3 and compare the lengths. You'll notice that you can get through Article 3, the judiciary, very, very quickly, because there's only like 2 paragraphs. Article 1 and Article 2, the legislature and the executive branch, that's a little bit more of a slog. And that also speaks to the fact that these branches were kind of conceived in practice as having more role and more of a role and more power. Now, finally, I'm going to take a sneak peek at an Enlightenment thinker who really only starts making an impact after the United States has declared independence from Great Britain, and that's, of course, Adam Smith. I'm going to talk a lot more about Adam Smith later on in the course, because one of the things that we associate Adam Smith with is the idea of laissez-faire free market capitalism. And the United States becomes, even among other capitalist countries, a super capitalist society. But I think it is kind of important to sort of lay out some of Smith's ideas because, of course, they will make an impact, especially much later on after independence. So we're going to talk a lot more about Smith later on, but I do want you guys to be aware, at least at this point, that Smith is considered part of this European Enlightenment. He challenges the idea of mercantilism, and he believes that human self-interest, the invisible hand of the marketplace, in other words, should regulate prices, not the government. So, in other words, economically, politically, religiously, you start to see a lot of attention that's focused on the role that the state plays in European and colonial American society. Next time, we'll talk about how that plays out in practice.